A very good morning to you sociologists. Here I am in Miss Smith's classroom because mine is currently being used. Don't tell her that I'm here, we'll leave it nice and tidy when we leave. We're going to look today at another sociological study looking at the Bowe and Gerwitz study from 1994 entitled Market Forces and Parental Choice. Now this is looking at the impact that class has on parents' ability to choose a secondary school for their children. Okay, and the kind of, it's not an acronym this time, but the kind of slogan we're using is that middle class parents can choose best schools. Okay, middle class parents can choose the best schools. Let's start off by looking at the kind of the research that Bowe and Gerwitz did, the kind of methods they used, and then we're going to pick apart what they found. I'm going to use this kind of map to help us with that. Okay, so starting with the research they did. To start off with, it was a combination of two types of research. Number one, secondary research, okay, looking at the information, specifically the addresses of the children that went to various secondary schools in the area. So they would look, for example, at Reigate School, and they would look at all of the addresses of the children in Reigate School, and they compare that to Warwick School and Oakwood School and St Bede's, and they would see where the children who attended those schools were coming from. That's really important for later, okay? So secondary research, looking at the pupil addresses. They also used some primary research, and this was very simple interviews, okay, with the parents and the children who attended various schools. They looked at 15 schools in total. So they had 15 schools, and they used some primary research in the form of interviews. Now this was conducted in 1994, so it's a little bit more recent than some of our other studies, and I'm just noticing that I'm cut off at the top there, so I'm going to have to crouch down as much as possible. It's a little bit more recent, and what they find is some really, really interesting stuff, and a little bit like sociology a lot of the time, it's kind of stuff that we would assume, but wouldn't necessarily know, so it's kind of the common sense stuff that's just being hammered home to us. So what they found is that parents from the middle class were able to have a wider variety of choice over which school they sent their child to. Parents from the working class were often limited in their choice, which then meant they had to send their child to the nearby school, the closest one to them, which might not be the best school. Have a look at this graph here. At the top of here, you've got child A's house. Over here, you've got child B's house. Now, child A and child B are from different classes, okay? So child A is from a working class family where both of their parents work, both the parents leave the house at 6 a.m, and therefore the parents haven't got a massive amount of time to spend with the child, so they have to get themselves to and from school, and they also can't afford things like public transport, so the child is resorted to walking to school, okay? Child B comes from the middle class family where both parents work, but one of them works more flexible hours and can afford to work from home, and therefore is around to drive the child to school or can afford to put the child on public transport. So child A, working class, child B, middle class. On this same map, you've got a school here. School 1 is 0.5 miles away from both children's houses. School 2, down the bottom, is 8 miles away from both children's houses. Now, if child A comes from a working class family where parents can't afford to pay public transport to send their child on long distances and haven't got the time to drive that child into school, they are resorted to walking to the nearest school that they have. Now that doesn't matter how good or bad that school is, that's the only school they have available to them. Okay, and this school just happens to be one which is underperforming. It happens to be one where the Progress 8 scores are lower than School 2. So by all accounts, academically, it's a worse school. But it's the only school that child A has the choice of going to. Child B, however, coming from a family where parents can afford the time and the money to take the child further to school, has the choice of both School 1 and School 2. Now, School 2 was recently graded outstanding by Ofsted, and children in that school make above average progress than other children in the local area. By all extents and purposes, it's a better school academically for a child to go to. So if you are the parent of child B, you now have the choice: do I send my child to School 1, which is underperforming, or do I pay for them or drive them to go to School 2, 8 miles away, which is overperforming, doing really, really well? Obviously, you're going to choose the better school because you want the best possible education for your child, which means that as a middle-class parent, you have more parental choice over where to send your child. And what Bowe and Gerwitz found was that middle-class parents were utilising this choice more. So the children in the higher achieving schools, their addresses were often from further away, and they were often from more affluent or richer areas because the parents could afford to send their children into the school. In the schools, remember there are 15 schools, in the schools that were the less good schools, the underperforming schools, the addresses of the pupils were often from pupils who lived down the road or half a mile away, because these were the children who had to come here rather than had the choice of where to go. And so what you've got is you've got a class difference in the type of school that a child can go to in terms of the parental choice. So the first thing that the middle class parents had over the working class parents was wealth. The ability to afford public transport or to drive their children to school, or thirdly, if they were really fortunate, they could actually move house. And they could move child B to a place nearer School 2 because they've got the money to afford to move house. So the first thing was wealth. The second reason that Bowe and Gerwitz found that parents had greater choice, parents from the middle class had greater choice over schools, was because parents in the middle class often had more time than parents from the working class. They also had more time. What this meant was that because maybe they worked flexible hours, or one of them maybe didn't work, one of them could afford not to work, parents from the middle class were able to afford the time to go and visit a number of schools. Let's say you moved to Reigate a week ago, okay, and you were looking at schools to go to in September. Now, if you had the time, which we all do right now, if you had the time, you would be able to go, if the schools were open, you'd be able to go to various different schools: St Bede's, Reigate Grammar, Reigate, Warwick, RA&A, Oakwood, Gatwick, Merston Park, all of these schools. You'd have the time to go and visit them. And then you could say, right, I really like that school, and I really liked the sociology teacher in that school, so I'm going to send my child to that one, and I really liked all these schools, but that one, I didn't like. And I can rule them out. And I can make a choice over which school I'm going to go to because I've been to see all of them. Middle class parents, these guys found, could do that more. Working class parents, however, who weren't able to afford that time, didn't have the ability to go and visit lots of schools, maybe didn't know people at those schools, and therefore had no idea if it was a good school or a bad school, and didn't have a choice. And therefore, again, are resorting to sending their children to the nearest school, which might be a good school or might be an underperforming school. So they're limited choice. And the third thing, and the final thing they also found, and we've talked about this a little bit in class, but I will do a separate video on this, middle class parents had more cultural capital. Had more cultural capital than working class parents, which again allowed them to support their children from home and also to send their children to a higher performing school because they had that cultural capital, which I will explain in another video because we've just reached 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. Okay, but just a quick recap. Middle class parents can choose the best schools. Why? Because they've got more wealth. they can afford to send their child further distances. Number two, they've got more time, which means they can go and look at various other schools and they can choose the best one. And number three, they have the cultural capital, which means they can help their children more when they're in school. And I will cover that in a later session. Thank you, Year 10.